December 7th, 1941. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, their flight decks still warm from launching what would become the most successful naval airstrike in history, turned northwest toward home waters. Below deck, in briefing rooms and mess halls, pilots celebrated. They had sunk or crippled 8 American battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed more than 2,000 Americans. The cost was minimal. Just 29 Japanese aircraft lost and fewer than 60 men. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto did not join the celebration. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and traveled extensively across the United States by automobile. He had seen the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the automobile plants of Detroit, and the shipyards lining both American coasts. While his staff toasted the victory, Yamamoto spoke quietly. "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." His officers dismissed the comment as unnecessary caution. At the moment, Japan appeared dominant. The American battleship fleet lay shattered in the mud of Pearl Harbor. The Philippines would fall within months. The Dutch East Indies, rich with oil, were nearly within Japan's grasp. Most critically, the United States had only 3 operational carriers left in the Pacific: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. Japan possessed 10. On paper, the outcome seemed obvious, but Yamamoto understood something his younger commanders did not. America's industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's. Before the war, American steel production exceeded Japan's by roughly 12 times. American shipyards could produce vessels Japan could scarcely imagine. The question was never whether the United States could replace its losses. The real question was whether Japan could force victory before America's industrial machine reached full momentum. 6 months later, the balance began to shift. June 4th, 1942. At Midway, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, burned. Flames tore through hangar decks where aircraft were being refueled and rearmed when American dive bombers suddenly appeared overhead. By nightfall, all 4 carriers had sunk. In a single afternoon, Japan's margin of carrier superiority vanished. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff absorbed the blow. 4 carriers lost, but 6 still remained: Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, Hio, Ryujo, and Zuiho. America had 3, perhaps 4, if Yorktown survived, which it did not. Japanese shipyards were already working on new carriers. The war of attrition, they believed, could still be won. What they did not know was that in Newport News, Virginia, Quincy, Massachusetts, Brooklyn, New York, Norfolk, Philadelphia, and Camden, American shipyards had already laid the keels for an entirely new class of aircraft carrier. Not 1 or 2, but 24. And these ships would be larger, faster, and more capable than anything Japan had ever constructed. They were the Essex-class carriers. The Essex-class design had been finalized before Pearl Harbor, but construction accelerated dramatically after Midway. The lead ship, USS Essex, had her keel laid on April 28, 1941. By the time war arrived in December, her hull was already rising from the slipway. After Midway, production intensified. Shipyards moved to round-the-clock operations. Welders worked beneath floodlights. Riveting echoed day and night without pause. In Japan, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal was constructing Taiho, the most advanced fleet carrier Japan would ever produce. She featured an armored flight deck, an enclosed bow, and improved damage control systems. Taiho represented the peak of Japanese naval engineering. Her keel had been laid in July 1941. Completion would take nearly 3 years. Essex would take just 20 months. April 30th, 1943. USS Essex was commissioned at Newport News. She displaced 33,000 tons, carried roughly 90 aircraft, and could make 33 knots. Her flight deck stretched 872 feet. Her crew numbered more than 2,600 men. She was larger than every Japanese carrier except the converted battleship Shinano, which would not be completed for another year. In Tokyo, naval intelligence noted the event. One new American carrier was concerning, but not yet disastrous. Japanese carriers were still operating effectively in the Solomon Islands. Shokaku and Zuikaku remained formidable. Taiho would soon join the fleet. The war of attrition continued. Then the reports began arriving more quickly. August 17, 1943. USS Yorktown was commissioned, the second Essex-class carrier named for the ship lost at Midway. She matched Essex in size and capability. November 24th, USS Lexington entered service, the third of the class, bearing the name of the carrier sunk at the Coral Sea. December 15th, USS Bunker Hill was commissioned. December 31st, USS Wasp and USS Cowpens entered service on the same day. By the end of 1943, 6 Essex-class carriers were operational. Intelligence reports showed many more under construction. Inside the Navy Ministry in Tokyo, officers studied these figures with growing unease. America was commissioning fleet carriers faster than Japan could build destroyers. The implications were staggering. Commander Masatake Okumiya, a naval aviator serving on the staff of the Third Fleet, later wrote that the arrival of the Essex-class marked the moment Japan's strategists realized they were fighting an opponent that operated by entirely different rules. Japan built ships slowly and carefully, emphasizing craftsmanship. America built them the way it built automobiles, on assembly lines, with standardized parts, at a pace that seemed almost unreal. The Essex-class carriers were not just numerous, they were excellent. Their design reflected lessons learned in the first years of war: improved damage control, heavier anti-aircraft defenses, expanded aviation fuel capacity, and deck-edge elevators that dramatically increased sortie rates. In many respects, they were superior even to Japan's newest carriers, and America was building them faster than Japan could ever hope to sink them. February 17, 1944, USS Hornet was commissioned, the 7th Essex-class carrier. March 20th, USS Franklin entered service, the 8th. April 24th, USS Ticonderoga followed, the 9th. May 15th, USS Randolph became the 10th. The pace was accelerating, roughly one fleet carrier every month. Japan's entire pre-war carrier force had numbered only 10 ships, assembled over 2 decades. The United States was matching that total in less than a year, with carriers that were larger, faster, and more capable. Admiral Somu Toyota, who would assume command of the combined fleet in May 1944, later described the strategic situation bluntly. Japan, he explained, had entered the war fully aware it could not compete with American industrial output. The plan had been to seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, establish a defensive perimeter, and make the cost of breaking it so high that the United States would seek a negotiated peace. But that strategy depended on time. It required American public will to erode before industrial production reached its peak. The Essex-class carriers meant time had expired. By June 1944, the reality was impossible to ignore. Japan had lost most of its veteran carrier pilots during the Solomon Islands campaign. Their replacements were far less prepared. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators received nearly 2 years of training. By 1944, new pilots often had 6 months or less. Fuel shortages sharply limited flight hours. The skill gap between American and Japanese pilots had become enormous, and now Japan would no longer face 3 or 4 American carriers, but a force that outnumbered them beyond any realistic counter. June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese mobile fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, sailed to challenge the American invasion of Saipan. Ozawa commanded 9 carriers, fleet carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, along with 6 light carriers. Together, they carried approximately 450 aircraft. The American Fifth Fleet possessed 15 carriers. 7 were Essex-class, Hornet, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Essex, Lexington, and Enterprise. 8 were light carriers. Combined, they deployed nearly 900 aircraft. The disparity went beyond numbers. American pilots were experienced, highly trained, and flew superior aircraft. Japanese pilots were largely inexperienced, many flying their first combat mission. American carriers were equipped with radar, fighter direction officers, and coordinated defensive systems. Japanese defenses relied on visual spotting and individual initiative. The battle began at dawn. Japanese aircraft launched in 4 major waves. American radar detected them nearly 70 miles out. F-6F Hellcat fighters, guided by radar controllers, intercepted the attackers long before they reached the carriers. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Lieutenant Commander Robert Winston, flying from Lexington, later recalled that the Japanese formations approached steadily and in tight order, almost as if on a training flight. They took little evasive action and rarely broke formation under attack. American fighters cut through them with devastating ease. By the end of the day, Japan had lost approximately 330 aircraft. The losses did not end there. The fleet carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced, absorbed a single torpedo hit. Flawed damage control procedures allowed aviation fuel vapors to spread throughout the ship. Hours later, a spark ignited the fumes. The resulting explosion tore Taiho apart. She sank with nearly 1,600 men aboard. Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, suffered multiple torpedo strikes and went down that same afternoon. American losses were minimal, roughly 120 aircraft, most due to operational accidents rather than combat. Not a single American ship was damaged. The Battle of the Philippine Sea effectively destroyed Japan's carrier aviation arm. The loss of more than 300 pilots could not be replaced. The loss of 2 fleet carriers could not be recovered. But more importantly, the battle proved that Japan was now fighting a carrier force it had no realistic chance of defeating. 7 Essex-class carriers had participated. Intelligence reports showed more entering service every month. In the aftermath, Japanese naval leadership confronted the arithmetic. 6 carriers remained, 3 of them light carriers with limited capacity. The Americans now fielded more than 20 carriers, with additional ships commissioning continuously. The gap in pilot skill was immense and growing. The industrial imbalance was absolute. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who would later organize the first kamikaze units, spoke bluntly during a staff meeting. "We cannot win a conventional naval war," he said. "We lack the ships, the pilots, and the fuel." Every month, America adds carriers faster than we can sink them. The numbers no longer work. When asked how many carriers the United States might ultimately build, Onishi referred to intelligence estimates. "As many as they want," he replied. It was not exaggeration. By the war's end, the United States would commission 17 Essex-class carriers for combat service, with 7 more completed, too late to participate. In addition, America built over 100 escort carriers, smaller ships used for convoy protection and amphibious support. Japan's total wartime carrier production amounted to 6 fleet carriers, several light carriers, and a handful of escort conversions. The disparity extended far beyond ship counts. It encompassed the entire industrial ecosystem supporting those vessels. Each Essex-class carrier required approximately 47 million man-hours to construct. The United States possessed the shipyards, steel output, skilled labor, electronics, radar systems, aircraft, fuel, ordnance, and logistical networks needed to build and operate dozens simultaneously. Japan struggled to finish even one. Admiral Toyota later reflected that the appearance of the Essex-class carriers represented the realization of Yamamoto's pre-war fears. America had awakened. Once fully mobilized, its industrial power was overwhelming. Japan had assumed the United States would not bear the cost of prolonged war. Instead, Toyota noted, the cost, at least industrially, was negligible. They built carriers the way we built trucks. The comparison was accurate. In 1944, American shipyards launched roughly one major warship every 3 days: battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Japan's entire shipbuilding industry could not match the output of American carrier construction alone. October 24th, 25th, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan's final major naval operation. The plan was desperate. Japan's remaining carriers would serve as bait, drawing American carrier forces north while battleships and cruisers attempted to strike the invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf. Admiral Ozawa's carrier force consisted of 4 carriers: Zuikaku, the last survivor of Pearl Harbor, and 3 light carriers. Together, they carried roughly 116 aircraft, barely more than a single American fleet carrier. Many of these planes were trainers or obsolete models. Pilot quality was disastrously poor. Opposing them, Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet fielded 8 fleet carriers, 6 of them Essex-class: Intrepid, Hancock, Hornet, Franklin, Lexington, and Essex. These ships carried approximately 700 aircraft. Ozawa's mission was not victory, it was sacrifice. His carriers were intended to be destroyed, luring American forces away from Leyte Gulf. This was the final acknowledgement that Japan's carrier arm no longer served a combat purpose. American aircraft located Ozawa's carriers on October 25th. Strike after strike followed. Zuikaku, which had attacked Pearl Harbor and fought at Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, and the Philippine Sea, absorbed multiple bomb and torpedo hits. She capsized and sank that afternoon. The 3 light carriers soon followed. Japan's carrier force ceased to exist. In Tokyo, naval leaders understood the war was lost. The loss of the ships themselves mattered little. Japan lacked the pilots, aircraft, and fuel to operate them regardless. What mattered was what those losses symbolized. America's industrial power had produced a fleet Japan could neither challenge nor meaningfully damage. The Essex-class carriers continued to enter service. USS Bonhomme Richard, commissioned in November 1944, USS Lake Champlain in April 1945, USS Philippine Sea in May. They arrived to find no Japanese carriers left to fight. Post-war interrogations conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey repeatedly returned to the same conclusion. Japan's defeat was inevitable. Once American industrial production fully mobilized, Admiral Toyota was asked when he realized Japan could no longer win. His answer was precise. It was when intelligence reports revealed the pace of American carrier construction. Statistics alone had not conveyed the truth, but watching fleet carriers appear month after month made it undeniable. We could not build them that fast. We could not train pilots that fast. We could not produce aircraft or fuel at that speed. When asked why Japan continued fighting, Toyota paused. Because surrender was unthinkable, he finally said. And because we hoped, perhaps irrationally, that America's will would break before our capacity did. The Essex-class carriers represented more than naval power. They embodied the industrial gulf that made the Pacific War's outcome unavoidable once America fully mobilized. Japan's gamble had been that it would not need to match American production. The Essex-class proved that gamble fatally wrong. They arrived too quickly, in too great a number, with too much capability. They transformed the Pacific from a contested ocean into an American lake. Of the 17 Essex-class carriers that saw combat, not one was sunk. Several were severely damaged. All returned to service. Their resilience underscored the futility of Japan's late war strategies, including kamikaze attacks, which arose from the realization that conventional warfare could not overcome American production. The Essex-class carriers were not merely ships. They were the visible expression of American industrial might, appearing again and again, like an unstoppable tide. And in the end, the ocean belonged to them.